You're listening to Ecto Portal, a journey into the unknown with Anthony Anderson and Verna Wilson.
I hope that you are seated comfortably, with the light turned down and the curtains drawn.
Hello, once again, to another journey into the unexplored, the unexplained Ecto Portal. I'm Anthony Anderson, your host, and I'm here with my co-host,
Verna Wilson.
And we will not be
Hi,
burning her
everybody.
at the stake today. But we are going to do a show about a woman, Bridget Cleary, who had an unfortunate end with another witch encounter. This was being the last witch in Ireland. And this was in 1895, the late 1800s. And we've done shows before about witches, the last witch in England. I think we covered the last witch in the U.S. as well. So it'll be interesting to talk about this particular case in Ireland.
The interesting part about this is that it took place in the late 1800s. And I understand that Ireland's a country where they keep their beliefs very much alive. Their folklore is part of who they are. But a lot of them don't go that far. A lot of the people, the locals there, don't go that far when it comes to their beliefs. They believe it, but they kind of leave it alone for the most part.
When I was in Ireland, we went to a few places where the history of the Fae, that's what the fairies were called, where the woods where the Fae were supposedly supposed to really come from. And we kind of explored some of those woods, some of the stories that people had. So they still exist. In fact, there's areas where Fae supposedly existed, like a tree stump or a big tree that had been cut down, but they'll do like a roundabout around the tree because they don't want to get rid of the tree for fear if they try and dispose of or upset the Fae, if that's where they lived. That they'll have bad luck. And there's actually places around Ireland where that still exists.
Oh no, it still exists, but the locals prefer to just sort of leave it alone rather than engage in it, is what I meant to say.
Yeah, some of them will poo-poo it, but some of them are like, it's kind of a twink and a nod to the Fae, like, we're not going to say whether it's real or it's not real, but we do kind of acknowledge it, I think.
Right, and there are actually a couple of modern witches who live in Ireland, in a village in Ireland, and they say the locals treat them great. They're just known as the village witches. Janet Farrar and Gavin Bone. They have written some books, and they actually have a DVD about their witchcraft, the craft that they. Yeah, and they live in Ireland, and even though they're both British, but they live in Ireland, and they said the locals treat them great, and they're known as the local witches of the village, and nobody bothers them, and they have a great life there.
Yeah,
I'd love to get them on the show one of these days.
Yeah, that'd be cool. What's interesting is now they're more open to celebrate their past, folklore, their cultures. And a lot of these stories come from, obviously, the past when things weren't always so black and white and religion kind of overpowered people's objectives and what they were going to do and not do. And in this case, in violent activity, burning someone alive because of, lack of belief or or maybe their beliefs told them to believe things a certain way. Now it's more, they celebrate the past, history, but also the actual folklores themselves. So I think a modern day witch is kind of a symbol of keeping the folklore alive, but also, keeping the art alive as well, besides the history.
Right. Keeping the craft of it alive. I agree with that.
Mm-hmm.
So, yep. but this woman was not a witch. She was an independent woman, which was very unusual for those times. Yep. And I guess I'm going to go ahead and go into the story and read about it, and then I'm going to go ahead and give my take about her. So,
go for it.
When Joanna Burke went to pay her cousin Bridget Cleary a visit, she found the 26-year-old being held down and force-fed a concoction of herbs and milk. The men restraining her were 3 of Joanna's brothers, an elderly neighbor named John Dunn, and Bridget's own husband, Michael. Bridget, who was a dressmaker and an egg seller from Ballyvadlia near Clonmel, County Tipperary, had been taken ill and bedridden for a number of days. She had remained under the watchful care of Michael, who had sent for a doctor in a nearby town and at one point requested a priest. By Thursday, March 14th, 1895, he also sent for herbs obtained from a witch doctor type named Dennis Gainey. By that stage, Michael Cleary was gripped by the belief that his wife was a malevolent fairy changeling. According to a court report in the Irish Times on March 27th of that year, Joanna said the men forced Bridget to take the herbs, and Cleary asked her, "Are you Bridget Boland, the wife of Michael Cleary, in the name of God?" She answered twice, but when she refused to answer a third time, she was hauled up and held in a sitting position over the slow-burning embers of the kitchen fire. Bridget seemed to be wild and deranged, especially when they were so treating her, according to the report. She eventually responded, "I am Bridget Boland, daughter of Pat Boland, in the name of God," referring to her maiden name. The above story would form just one part of a series of violent acts against Bridget that would lead to her death. It is also the testimony of Joanna Burke, the Crown's chief witness in a landmark murder case in which 8 people would be convicted for their roles in Bridget's abuse.
Michael Cleary, who was 35 at the time, was a cooper from Killinall Company, Tipperary. The two had been married for about 8 years, and they had no children. And as far as Joanna Burke could see, the couple were on good terms, and she never saw them quarrel or fight. Now, while taking a walk to deliver eggs in Cailina Grenog, the site of the fairy ring, according to local folklore, Bridget Cleary had caught a chill. Her house was often occupied by a smattering of neighbors and relatives, and many of whom had been embroiled in Michael Cleary's growing belief in a supernatural basis for his wife's sickness. Now, according to a 1995 analysis by Angela Burke, this belief may also have been boosted by the presence of their neighbor Dunn, who was more aligned with the oral fairy traditions that were very much dying out as the 19th century closed. A fairy changeling, the lore would have it, was a duplicate put in the place of a real person, often a woman or a child, after they were abducted by fairies. Now, in the house the next day, Friday, March 15th, Bridget told Michael she could see the police at the window and he should leave her be. He responded by throwing the contents of a nearby chamber pot over her and at the window. Bridget was dressed and brought to the kitchen. At that time, Joanna, her mother, Mary Kennedy, Bridget's father, Pat Boland, and Joanna's brother, Pat Kennedy, were all sitting talking.
They were talking about the fairies, and Mrs. Cleary said to her husband, "Your mother used to go with the fairies, and that is why you think I am going with them." Michael then prepared 3 pieces of bread and jam, demanding Bridget eat all 3 before she could drink a cup of tea made for her by Joanna again. He asked her for her identity 3 times. She answered twice and ate 2 pieces of bread, according to the Irish Times court report. When she did not answer the 3rd time, he forced her to eat the 3rd bit, saying, "If you won't take it, down you will go," according to Joanna. He threw her to the ground and mounted her with a knee on her chest and a hand on her throat. "Swallow it," he said. "Is it down? Is it down?" He grabbed a hot stick from the fire and held it close to her mouth. Finally, he stripped her to her chemise, doused her in lamp oil a number of times, and set her alight. "It is not my wife," Michael reportedly said while she burned. "I am not going to keep an old witch in place of my wife. So I must get back my wife, he said, referring to the traditional expectation that once the changeling died, the abducted loved one would return riding a white horse.
"It is not Bridget I am burning," Cleary said to Joanna. "You will soon see her go up the chimney." The reporter adds that the delivery of this line caused a sensation in the courtroom. "She was burning on the hearth. The house was full of smoke and smell," said Joanna in her testimony. "When I looked down to the kitchen, I saw the remains of Bridget Cleary on the floor lying on a sheet." The policemen had been combing the green yards and fields of Ballybodlia, Ireland, for a week. When they finally found Bridget Cleary, the 26-year-old's body had been wedged beneath several inches of clay and jumble of thorn bushes. But her corpse showed wounds caused by something much worse than branches. Her spine and lower limbs were so badly burned that parts of her skeleton were exposed. She was naked except for a stocking and one gold earring, and her head was encased in a sack. Pat Kennedy helped carry the remains from the house. 10 people, all of whom were in the house at some point throughout the ordeal, were arrested. The case was widely covered with the story reaching London and even across the Atlantic. According to Angela Bork, the Tory papers treated it as fodder for reinforcing the idea that the barbarism of rural Ireland, while papers at home were quickly to distance themselves from the act. Contemporary Onion piece in the Irish Times said it was unfair to tar the peasantry, though the Clearys were far from peasants, with the same brush, just as unfair as it is to hold that EastEnders are devoured by demoniacal thirst for blood because Jack the Ripper figured amongst them. The evidence heard, only a fraction of which explored in the article, was elaborate and involved many conflicting testimonies spanning a number of days. The Joanna Burke's is the version that all defendants, including her 4 brothers, agreed on.
Cleary, whom the papers described as a respectably dressed man, though his eyes had a wild kind of look, was prone to outbursts during the trial, charging his co-accused with colluding against him. Others who were in the house at different times over 2 days were tried for their involvement, though the ones present for the burning were terrified and asked Michael to stop. They didn't physically act to help Bridget, the prosecution argued. Charging the jury, Mr. Justice O'Brien said, "This most extraordinary case demonstrated a degree of darkness in the mind not just of one person, but of several. A moral darkness, even religious darkness, the disclosure of which had come with surprise on many persons. The charge against Cleary would be dropped from murder to manslaughter. He was convicted and sentenced to 20 years in penal servitude. 7 others were convicted of wounding Bridget: Joanna's 4 brothers and her mother Mary, Bridget's father, and the neighbor John Dunn. With the exception of Mary, each received a sentence ranging from 6 months to 5 years of penal servitude." What a case.
Wow. Yeah, it's interesting because it's almost, we have the old world where if this happened to somebody and in fact, you can even see it in one of the earlier articles, not the court, but one of the earlier articles where the local town commented that, oh, well, obviously they gave her herbs, and so they obviously buyed into the old school method that she must be bewitched, whereas the courts had a completely the opposite. Like, let's look at this as basically a homicide case. This man's obsessed with the old methods. Him and the neighbors were gossiping about her beforehand and said, "Oh, she must be a witch based on what I know, based on what you know." And they were already had it in their minds that she was bewitched. They were going to feed her this tea with these herbs in it and force her to for the changeling to come out. So they were already convinced that she was taken over by the fairies and it was a changeling in her place. So it's interesting to see how their absolute community obsession and belief in this activity versus the actual courts, which was the opposite. Is these people hurt this woman, they killed her, they mutilated her, and they actually gave them all time and punishment for that. So it's almost like a story right on the cusp of old age versus new, where barbarism is kind of in the past, but this story is right kind of on the edge. It's sad because these people were doing this thinking this is what they were raised to believe, this is what they think would resolve the situation, But then you have the court saying, no, that's the old days. That is barbaric. It is evil. It is not. It makes no sense. It's not real. You people have literally ganged up together and killed this woman.
Okay,
so it's
but
kind of
let's look
sad.
on-
I can see both sides, is what I'm saying. I can see, not that I condone it, but I can understand why they would, after years and centuries of these beliefs, and obviously the Fae and the fairies, and the change of their belief in customs and folklore.
Okay.
It was real to them. It wasn't just fiction. It was, this kind of stuff was real to them.
Okay.
So to suddenly have the courts changing, I could see where the courts would be, this is horrible. What these people did was absolutely horrible. There's no
It was
proof of
horrific,
anything
yeah.
except the
Uh-huh.
book. So
Okay.
I
But
could
on-
see where you could go to both sides.
Okay, you can go on both sides, but let's go ahead and break this down on the personal side as well as the superstitious side. She was an ill woman. When you're that sick and somebody's force feeding you and asking you questions and putting you in front of a hot hearth where you already have a fever and you're probably already burning up, you're not going to answer correctly. She was around people who she grew up with, who she can trust, and including her own husband, who lived with her for 8 years. And
her cousin, and her father, and the neighbor.
Yeah. Now, if you've grown up, those villages and those places, especially at that time, they were very close communities back then. You would think that after being married to somebody for 8 years, and also people who are around who know you well, they could tell who you are. They know your habits. They know the way you talk. They could tell who you are. And even if they feel that you've been near a fairy mound and something happened to you, there is no reason to watch somebody you care about being doused with oil and being burned and doing nothing to stop it. There is no excuse. None.
What's interesting is it sounded like in the beginning when he talked to the neighbors, how it sounds like because she was sick, obviously she wasn't going to be acting like herself when you're sick. But as she was sick, he obviously got a bug in his ear from the neighbor, and also other family members, and obviously probably people in the community that said, oh, well, she's sick. Oh, something's wrong with her. Oh, maybe she's not who she should be. Maybe she's not herself. Maybe she's been replaced by the fairies. Maybe there's a changeling in her place.
But that's what I mean, though.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying is, it sounds like she was just so sick, which what she really needed was a doctor.
And he called for a doctor in the beginning, but he didn't keep him there.
Yeah, and a priest too. So obviously, if the priest couldn't do anything, so it just sounds like he listened to the neighbors' gossip about, oh, well, she must be bewitched. She must be a changeling. She must not be real. You need to do something about it. You need to take matters into your own hands.
Okay, now as somebody who grew up Catholic, when you call a priest, usually call a priest because somebody's dying to give you last rites. So she must have been really, really sick, and he probably felt she was going. When you're that sick, you can't answer clearly.
I mean, I could see them getting a priest to bless her, or maybe he thought it would help, to drive the changeling away, or I don't know.
That's true, but in most cases they don't do that. They don't call a priest unless it's really unless they're pretty convinced that the person's going. In most cases.
But obviously he must have sent the priest away because he wasn't around when he burned her.
No, he sent him away, which was a mistake because the priest wouldn't have permitted it if he was there.
See, that's what makes me believe that if he sent her away, I think he was just trying to bring the priest to drive out whatever was in her, supposedly. Mm-hmm. And I think when he couldn't do that, he just got rid of him and said, okay, you know what, we're gonna do this on our own. We're gonna take matters into our own hands and get rid of the changeling.
So we got an herbalist to
come out.
An herbalist, one who dabbled in the witchcraft at the time. There was a lot of hedge witches back then, people who dabbed in herbalism, and the herbalist was probably trying to instruct him, but I'm surprised he let it go that far.
Well, I mean, for an herbalist, I could see where that wouldn't hurt somebody. If they were sick, it might be not great, but it's not the same as hoisting you up over the coals in your fireplace in your hearth of your house, trying to drive a changeling out of your body, which to me, that means you've just gone over the edge. There's nothing, you can obviously think of nothing else to do but to hold her over the fire to drive out this changeling. So that means
Right.
desperation. He obviously believed the changeling was there, regardless of the herbs, that obviously he thought it didn't do any good.
The one thing I was wondering about with the herbalist could have came there with good intentions, not necessarily to drive the herbs to drive the changeling out, but maybe herbs to heal and help her. And maybe he was trying to help her, but maybe it wasn't good enough for this crazy man, and this crazy man decided that they're not good enough, and he tried all kinds of other things, and she was too weak to defend herself. And of course, if you have all these people around you and they're all holding you down and you're sick, what are you going to do? And he sounds like he was deranged, like something was wrong with him.
Yeah, I think the herbalist, the whole point of that was, oh yeah, she's not herself, she's not feeling well, so I think something might be up here. Give her these herbs in a tea and see if this will help. I think that's probably the intention of that. But he was said he was so convinced that she was a malevolent fairy changeling by that point that he already had it in his head that she was replaced. So I don't know if there's anything that could have fixed this at this point. He was obsessed. They were all obsessed with this evil that's in our house, and we have to replace her. So, and it said you have to destroy the changeling in order for the original person to come riding back on a white horse. Wow, that's not far-fetched at all. I mean, that means you're going to have to kill the body, and then your wife will come back. Who would? It's amazing people would believe that.
Well, to me, it's amazing that they would let it go that far, even if they did believe it, because they knew that there was such a thing called being tried for murder. They saw this woman being burned, being tortured. So they should have. I mean, these were people who probably had some degree of common sense before all of this happened, and they should have just stopped him and said, "Listen, jackass, you're going too far. Stop. The woman's ill."
Well, if you remember the court testimonies, it said some of them did tell him, "Enough, stop."
But they didn't. They did nothing. Yeah, they did nothing.
No.
So she was around people she trusted and who she grew up with, and this poor woman had stood no chance. And I was reading a little bit about her history. She was known as a very independent woman before she married this man. She was a dressmaker and an egg seller. She was known in the village as somebody who was well liked in the community. And the interesting thing about this man, when she first married him, and I read about this in another article, was that they met in the village and they married, but she didn't go live with him right away. She actually went back to her parents. I don't know if she did that for economical reasons or they didn't have a house yet. And they didn't live together for the first few years of their marriage. They actually lived together later, and of course it turned into 8 years. But you would think living with somebody that you're married to for 8 years, that no matter what was going on, you would want that person to heal and then figure it out later. I couldn't even imagine doing that to somebody I love.
Yeah,
I think something was wrong with him.
She just became the victim of old school beliefs and superstition. I mean, it's the same as what we read about witches in the U.S. and witches in England, about local communities. Just obviously someone's doing something different, and in this case she wasn't. She was just ill. But their complete and utter faith and belief in fae and fairies and this changeling obviously had enough of an impact, like, oh my god, I never thought it could happen to someone here. It did. Oh my god, it must be that. And then it just snowballed. That kind of stuff is so evil. It just snowballs.
Yeah.
That I think that's what happened here. I think once he was convinced by his neighbors, because neighbors like to gossip. They want to watch this stuff, So they're telling him, yeah, it's a changeling. She's bewitched. You better do something about it. They're just egging him on, but they're all spectators. They're watching. So it kind of has that community, pitchfork mentality in a way, where someone else's misery is their delight and entertainment. It's sad but true.
Yeah. So it's a very sad story. It's a sad story that another victim. It's a human life taken simply because people could not get out of their own. well, in my opinion, a human life taken because people did not stop to help when somebody went too far.
Yep.
That's how I feel about it.
Agreed.
So, yeah, and I think that a lot of these superstitious beliefs. I have not visited Ireland. You have, but I've talked to people from over there, and they tell me that the beliefs are and the stories that run very strong in their families, and they believe it. But for the most part, they leave it alone because they feel that it's one of those beliefs where you have to let it be, because for different reasons. For them, it's because of for modern day people I've talked to said the environment, that they have to fix the environment, and they have to make the earth a better place, because these are beliefs that are held close to the earth, and they feel a lot of fairy colonies are very angry. But that's a whole different story. But anyway, that's what I've been told.
I think it was a good thing that the courts and law eventually started saying, you know what, regardless of some weird mystical evil that you can't show me right now, whatever beliefs, whatever ancient, dark evil you think exists in your community, in your forests, and in your wife, you can't produce it for me now. I'm going to hold you accountable for what you've done to another person. I think
I absolutely agree.
Obviously, for the better that happened, because so many people now are held accountable for what they have done or what they intended to do, versus, oh, well, obviously you did that because of this, so therefore it's okay. No, it was better all around that we, and obviously this story was on, like I said, on the cusp of that, where the court started to say, you know what, no, this wasn't a witch. No, this is an incident where you thought she was possessed by a changeling or replaced, and you burned her alive, essentially. And all you people helped. So all of you, they were all punished. So that tells me we're definitely moving into the modern era there.
Right, where they were held accountable. And gosh, the way they found her, naked except for a stocking and one gold earring, and her head was encased in a sack. That's gruesome. Yeah. Her
corpse and wounds stuck in the clay and the brambles and thorn bushes.
Yeah, that's
see, at that
terrible.
Point, you're stashing the body. You're not presenting the body saying, look, she was a changeling. You now realized you killed your wife, and you now are trying to hide the body. That's what that says. So
and they
obviously
they all paid for their crimes.
Yep, and I don't think she rode back on a white horse, I'm pretty sure. But they went to prison.
So they went to prison, they did their time.
Story,
very sad story. Yeah.
Yep. It's a different variation of the same kind of story we read about England and the US with the Salem witches and stuff. But it's interesting because it's on the cusp of the world is changing the way it looks at folklore, tradition, and beliefs. So it's an interesting story because it's on the cusp of both the old and the new world, I think.
Absolutely. And I'd love to have I'd love to have somebody come on who's from Ireland, and if they have some folk stories from their family, talk about it and talk about how these stories affect Ireland today. I'd love that.
That would be awesome. That would be great.
Yeah.
Good show.
Yeah.
All right. That's it for this week, folks. And until next week, I guess we're going to go ahead and sign off, and we'll see you then. Bye.
See you next week. Bye.
Royalty-free, copyright-free music by Kevin MacLeod and Ross Bugden.